I still remember where I was. It was a rainy afternoon, and the television was on more for background noise than anything else. The room smelled faintly of coffee and damp wood, the kind of scent that makes you pause without knowing why. The announcer's voice shifted suddenly in tone, urgent, yet reverent. "Habemus papam," he said. My breath caught. I turned my head toward the screen, and there he was. A man dressed in white, standing on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. But it wasn't the robe that struck me. It was the silence. He didn't raise his arms in triumph. He didn't smile in triumph. He stood there like someone who had been called unexpectedly, someone who had just heard the weight of heaven fall on his shoulders. And then he spoke. "Brothers and sisters, good evening." That's all it took. No thunderous declarations, no rehearsed speeches, just a greeting so human, so simple, that tears welled up in my eyes before I even realized what was happening. His voice had a warmth that didn't need translation. His eyes behind thick lenses were tired but kind. And his name, Francisco, echoed through the square like a whisper from God. I didn't know much about him then. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, an Argentinian, a Jesuit, the first pope from the Americas, the first to choose the name of Saint Francis. But somehow, I felt like I already knew him, like his heart had entered the room with that greeting. I remember whispering out loud to no one in particular, "He's different." The world didn't know what to expect. Some were skeptical, others curious. But I think many of us felt a strange, hopeful stillness, like something sacred had shifted, not in the church but inside of us. That same evening, he bowed his head before blessing the crowd. "Pray for me," he asked. It was not a command, not a ritual formality. It was a plea. And in that moment, I realized something profound. This man, newly robed in white, did not want to be above us. He wanted to be among us. In the days that followed, he began to dismantle our expectations. He refused the luxurious papal apartments and chose to live in the modest guest house. He carried his own bag. He paid his own hotel bill. He spoke of a church that is poor and for the poor. These were not symbolic gestures for the media. They were choices born of conviction, and we who had grown accustomed to distance between the holy and the human suddenly felt seen. For the first time in a long while, the papacy didn't feel unreachable. It felt close. It felt like a friend had stepped into the room, a friend who understood pain, who had walked through suffering, who had learned to listen more than speak. I began to follow his words more closely, not because I was overly religious, but because I was hungry for something real. And every time he spoke, he left me with more than inspiration. He left me with questions, hard questions about how I lived, how I loved, how I treated the forgotten. I remember when he said, "Let us not forget, the real power is service." That line stayed with me. It gnawed at the corners of my comfort. It called me out of my self-contained world and invited me into something deeper. He wasn't just asking us to admire him. He was asking us to change. And yet there was nothing heavy-handed in his presence. He had a way of speaking truths that could cut through the hardest walls, and yet he did it like a grandfather speaking to a grandchild, firm but full of mercy. That's what made him different. But it was only the beginning, because what came next, what he did in the years that followed, would not only change the image of the papacy, it would change the way I understood what it meant to love. If this story has touched your heart so far, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're building a loving and faith-filled community, and your presence here is a blessing. Leave a comment with your name and city. We want to lift you up in our prayers and send you a special greeting in our next video. There were times, many times, when the world felt like it was unraveling. Fires in the Amazon, refugees drowning in the Mediterranean, children torn apart by bombs, by borders, by silence. And in the middle of all that noise, there was one voice that never shouted, but always found a way to be heard. His voice. Pope Francis didn't need grand speeches. He didn't hide behind doctrine. He used language like a fisherman uses a net, gently but with purpose. His words weren't meant to impress scholars. They were meant to find the brokenhearted, the ashamed, the abandoned. And somehow, they did. I remember watching one of his addresses during a global crisis. The square was empty because of the pandemic, and yet it felt more full than ever. He stood alone in the rain, under the weight of a world holding its breath. The sound of raindrops was louder than the cameras. The image, one man, old and fragile, walking slowly toward the altar, left me speechless. He wasn't performing. He was mourning with us. He prayed for the sick, for the grieving, for the exhausted healthcare workers. But more than anything, he reminded us that even in isolation, we were not alone. "We are all in the same boat," he said, "and we are being called to row together." Those words broke me, because they didn't come from someone who observed suffering. They came from someone who carried it. Pope Francis had known loneliness. He had known illness. He had walked the dusty alleys of the slums in Buenos Aires. He had sat beside people who were dying not just from sickness, but from invisibility. He understood something most leaders forget, that pain, when met with compassion, becomes sacred ground. Over the years, I watched him visit places most of us try not to look at. He bent down to wash the feet of prisoners, some of whom had betrayed even their own families. He hugged children disfigured by illness. He dined with the homeless in Rome, not as a photo op, but as a guest. I remember one photo where he was smiling at a man without teeth, as if he were looking at a prince. That image never left me. But what touched me even more were the words he used when speaking of those people. He never called them the poor, like they were some distant group. He called them our brothers and sisters. He refused to label them as a problem to fix. Instead, he named them as the face of Christ. That shook me, because it forced me to ask, do I look at them that way? He once said, "To love God and neighbor is not something abstract but profoundly concrete. It means seeing in every person the face of the Lord to be served." And I started seeing it. In the old man who sells roses by the station. In the mother with hollow eyes asking for coins. In the boy who sweeps the sidewalk, not playing, but surviving. Pope Francis didn't teach me charity. He taught me recognition. He taught me how to see what I used to overlook. I used to think holiness looked like stained glass and golden light. But under Pope Francis, holiness looked like dust on your shoes and tired eyes and trembling hands that still choose to bless. There was a gentleness in the way he spoke that made you feel like God wasn't far away after all. He didn't preach from a pedestal. He whispered from the ground. That's what made people listen. That's what made the powerful uncomfortable and the forgotten feel known. He once asked, "Who am I to judge?" And in 5 words, he dismantled centuries of fear for countless souls who had felt cast out by the church. He reminded us that the true power of faith is not control, it's mercy. But not everyone liked that. There were critics. There were loud voices, even within the church, who didn't understand his tenderness. They mistook it for weakness. But those of us who had ears to hear, we knew. We knew that courage isn't always about thunder. Sometimes it's about choosing love when judgment would be easier. And deep down, I knew something else too. This wasn't just a pope. This was a shepherd. One who smelled like his sheep. One who wasn't afraid of the wolves. One who would walk the valleys with us. And I had a feeling that the best, the most painful, the most beautiful parts of his mission were still to come. I began to notice a pattern, not just in his words, but in his footsteps. Everywhere Pope Francis went, he chose to walk where no one else wanted to. He didn't follow the polished routes of ceremony. He went toward the noise, the chaos, the hunger, the smell of the streets. While others turned their backs, he looked straight into the faces that the world had forgotten. I remember the first time I saw him hold a man with tumors covering his face. It wasn't a distant handshake or a polite pat. It was an embrace. His hands didn't tremble. His eyes didn't look away. And for that one moment, the man didn't look deformed. He looked holy. That's what Pope Francis did. He didn't just preach about dignity, he gave it by looking into your eyes and seeing more than your wounds. And I, watching from my living room, felt ashamed. How many people had I looked away from? How many times had I offered pity instead of presence? How many times had I given coins without compassion? He was calling us to something deeper than charity. He was calling us to proximity, to touch, to kinship. There was something about the way he said it too. The poor have much to teach us. Not, we must help the poor. Not, they need us. No, they have something to teach us. That turned everything upside down. Or maybe finally it turned things right side up. One of the stories that marked me was about his first Christmas as Pope. Instead of hosting a banquet in the Apostolic Palace, he visited a juvenile prison and washed the feet of young inmates, Muslim, Christian, atheist. One of them had tears streaming down his face. The Pope knelt before him, a symbol of power bowing before someone society had locked away. That image, I can't forget it. It wasn't theater. It was the gospel with skin. He kept doing it again and again, going to Lampedusa to mourn the drowned migrants, visiting favelas and refugee camps, kissing the hands of lepers, sitting in silence with Rohingya survivors, embracing children with AIDS. He once said that we must learn to weep, not just for the suffering, but with them. I used to think leadership was about being above others. But Francis showed me that the only place where we're truly great is when we're on our knees, serving someone who can give us nothing in return. He didn't tolerate poverty. He mourned it. He spoke harshly, not about people, but about systems that crushed the voiceless. He called out an economy that kills. He denounced greed, indifference, and what he called the globalization of indifference. I didn't fully understand the term when I first heard it. But then I started seeing it everywhere. People scrolling past tragedy, debates where pain became statistics, the way we had numbed ourselves to cries that didn't come from our own street. Francis woke me up. He taught that the true crisis of our time wasn't only economic or political, it was spiritual. A loss of tenderness, a loss of the sacredness of the other. And he didn't just say it from the pulpit, he lived it. I remember when he visited a shelter and noticed a man without shoes. Quietly, he removed his own and asked someone to give them to him. The man cried, not because he got shoes, but because someone saw him. That's what Francis did. He saw the elderly woman counting coins at the market, the immigrant trembling at the embassy door, the addict curled beneath a bridge, the woman holding her child on a cardboard mattress. He saw the invisible ones, and he made them visible. He often quoted St. Francis of Assisi saying, "Preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words." But the truth is, his words were actions. And the deeper I went into his story, the more I felt my own heart beginning to change. The walls I had built for comfort, for security, for pride, they began to tremble. Because once you've truly seen the face of Christ in the broken, you can never unsee it. I began asking myself daily, who have I failed to see today? Whose suffering did I ignore out of convenience? Francis taught me that holiness is not about being pure, it's about being present. It's about descending into the places most avoid and bringing light, not with judgment, but with embrace. And yet the most powerful moment of all, the one I believe was the heart of his whole mission, hadn't happened yet. It came in a quiet homily, one I almost missed but which would become the burning flame that remained in my soul long after he was gone. If this touched your soul in some way, help us carry this message to more hearts. Click like and subscribe to our channel. Together, we're forming a spiritual community of compassion and truth. Leave your name and city in the comments. We would love to send you a blessing and mention you in our next video. I didn't expect his voice to sound so calm. The cathedral was silent that day, as if the stones themselves were holding their breath. The cameras captured every flicker of his hand, every pause between words. It was one of his last public homilies, though no one knew it would be the last of that kind. But somehow you could feel it. The air felt different. There was a stillness that reached beneath the skin. He stood before the altar, not as a man in power, but as a servant, preparing to return home. His voice was soft, fragile, yes, but there was fire underneath, the kind of fire that burns slowly and doesn't go out. "If there is one thing I want to leave with you, only one," he said. "It is this: never stop loving, and never, never forget the poor." That was it. No long speech, no list of accomplishments. Just a trembling truth passed on like a sacred flame. I remember how he held his chest as he said it, as if the words were not just coming from his mouth, but from somewhere deep inside his soul. His eyes glistened, and so did mine, because in that moment I understood everything he had lived, everything he had fought for, every time he was misunderstood, criticized, or questioned. It had all been for that one reason: to teach us how to love. Not a love of words, but the kind that hurts, the kind that costs, the kind that makes you kneel at the feet of someone who cannot repay you, and still call it grace. He reminded us of Jesus in the streets, Jesus in the leper, Jesus in the hungry, Jesus in the prisoner. Not the sanitized Jesus of golden icons, but the one with dirt on his feet and blood on his hands. The Jesus who didn't cling to heaven, but came down to walk among us. That was the Christ Francis showed us. And as I sat watching him that day, I felt like I was being asked a question, not out loud, but in my soul. Have you really loved? He spoke of the widow who gives from her emptiness, the child who prays for her father in prison, the volunteer who stays up all night beside a stranger's hospital bed, the neighbor who leaves a bag of food at a door without waiting for thanks. These, he said, are the saints among us. He didn't ask us to be perfect. He asked us to be present. He didn't call us to be heroes. He called us to be human, fully human, the way God intended. He said something else that haunts me even now. The greatest danger in this world is not hatred, it is forgetting. Forgetting that we belong to one another. And I knew what he meant. Because I have forgotten. We all have. We forget when we rush past the man sleeping on the sidewalk. We forget when we curse someone from the safety of our car. We forget when we measure people by what they can give us. We forget when we reduce others to headlines, to numbers, to them. But Francis remembered. Always. Even as his body grew weak, even as his hands shook, his eyes never stopped seeking the ones no one else would see. And that day, as he gave us his final plea, he didn't ask for monuments or applause. He didn't ask for loyalty. He asked for something far harder. Love the people the world teaches you to forget. That sentence has stayed with me ever since. He didn't romanticize poverty. He didn't preach comfort. He invited us to weep, to feel, to give, to change. He didn't point at us from above. He walked beside us. And even now, as I recall that homily, I feel as if he's still whispering in my ear. Go. Serve. And remember, no one is invisible in the eyes of God. That day ended quietly. He stepped back. The crowd rose. Some clapped, others cried. And somewhere, deep inside, I felt something rising in me. A call. A choice. Because when someone gives their life to love, the only answer is to love back. The day he left us, the bells of St. Peter's rang a little slower. I remember waking up to the news as if the whole world had exhaled at once. Silence flooded the streets. Not the kind of silence that follows shock, but the kind that comes after a soul has returned home. Pope Francis had gone. And yet, he hadn't. Because as I sat there staring at the screen, at the thousands gathered in the square with candles and rosaries, I felt him. Not in his voice this time, not in a message or a gesture, but in me. I saw his eyes in the woman comforting a stranger in the crowd. I saw his tenderness in the hands of a priest giving a quiet blessing. I saw his courage in the young people holding signs that read, "Love without limits, serve without fear." His body may have returned to dust, but his spirit, oh, his spirit had multiplied. In the days that followed, Tributes came from every corner of the earth. Presidents, children, prisoners, refugees, beggars, bishops. But it was the small testimonies that moved me most. A homeless man in Buenos Aires whispered, "He never passed by without greeting me." A young nurse in Italy said, "He helped me believe again in God and in people." That's the legacy he left. Not golden thrones, not political triumphs, but hearts changed, minds awakened, lives humbled. He didn't die a pope. He died a father, a shepherd, a brother. He left no inheritance of riches, only a path to walk, a model to follow, and a love too big to fade. And I cannot go back to who I was before him. He shattered my indifference. He taught me that to love is not an extra. It is the center of everything. That God is not an idea, but a face. A wounded, radiant face in the one next to me. That prayer is not just words, but action. That holiness is not for the few, but for those who dare to love when it costs. I started looking people in the eyes more. I stopped avoiding pain and began walking toward it. I opened my home to someone who had none. I listened longer. I judged less. I wept more. And somewhere along the way I realized I was not only honoring Francis's memory, I was becoming a part of it. Because love never ends where a life ends. Love continues in gestures, in mercy, in justice, in forgiveness offered when it's hardest, in food shared, in time given, in enemies embraced, in remembering the poor not just as recipients of charity, but as bearers of grace. This was the seed he planted in all of us, and now it is ours to water. He is gone. But every time I choose love over fear, humility over pride, generosity over comfort, I feel him nodding, smiling as if to say, "Yes, that's the way." So I light a candle by my window tonight, not in mourning, but in hope. Because the man who reminded us to never stop loving and he will never be forgotten. Thank you for joining me in this journey of remembrance and light. If this story touched your soul, I warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Your support is part of a growing family of compassion and truth. Leave a comment with your name and city so we can lift you in our prayers and greet you in love in the next video. And don't stop here. A new video is waiting for you, one that could reveal something powerful and glorious in your life. Click the video that's appearing now on your screen and keep walking in light. With all my heart, thank you for being here. Amen.